Mattias Desmet, Professor Mattias Desmet. Welcome to Eyes Wide Open. Thanks a lot for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. We've made our way over here to Ghent to enjoy this podcast with you. Beautiful town, great surroundings. First time in Belgium, although it was a little bit touch and go whether we'd actually make it because we got caught up in the whole flight delay scandal at the moment. Ryanair was 4 hours late and we had to sleep in the airport in Charleroi. Travel first bus in the morning, and we were worried about whether we'd actually make it or not. So we're glad to be here. We're thanks for having us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So I mean, I've been looking at your stuff for quite a while. When you first was catapulted onto the scene during the pandemic, I first saw you on an English podcast. I forget the title of the podcast now, but it was my father said to me, he said, you've got to watch this guy. This guy has got a brilliant analysis of what's going on in the pandemic. Watch the podcast, and you introduced me to something that was brand new to me, which was mass formation psychosis. And the way you explained it, the way you provided the analysis, lots of pennies started to drop with me, or pieces of the jigsaw fell into place, and all of a sudden I could see more clearly what was actually happening during the pandemic. And it was once I began to understand mass formation as a concept, I began to see it everywhere. It wasn't just in the corona situation. You could start to see historical examples of mass formation, current ones, and it really was quite it made a profound impact on me. And since then, I kind of use that a lot in my own arguments when I'm talking to people about what's going on. And then you announced you were writing a book, which is this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. This was published when? Recently?
The Dutch version was published 3 months ago or something. And now the English version was published last week.
Right, okay, so we're fresh, hot off the press.
2 or 3 days ago.
Yeah, well, mine's a little bit dog-eared because I've read it quite a few times now, but it's an excellent book. I recommend it to anybody, and it's very lucid, very well explained, and it's really good. So tell us a little bit about how you came about, coming up with the book. Was this an idea that you had before the pandemic, or was this something that came from, being catapulted onto the world stage, as it were?
Yes, well, I started to take notes on the topic of mass formation and totalitarianism about 5 years ago, I think, back in 2017. Then I noticed already that a new kind of totalitarianism might be emerging in our society. Not a fascist totalitarianism, as we have seen in the first half of the 20th century, but rather this kind of totalitarianism which Hannah Arendt, who wrote this wonderful book, The Origins of a Totalitarianism, warned us already for in 1951. She said then, we've seen the collapse of Nazism. We will witness the collapse of Stalinism as well, soon, she said. But I expect that after that, a new totalitarianism will emerge. This time, not a totalitarianism that is led by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler, but rather by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. So she warned the world for the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism, which would rely in the first place on technological control, and which would be led by technocratic experts. And back in 2017, I observed, or at least I was thinking that we could clearly notice how both at the level of the population and at the level of the elite, a new kind of totalitarianism was coming. Like at the level of the masses, at the level of the population, you could see that there were more and more people who believed that only technological control could save us from all the disasters that were waiting for us, like climate change or terrorism or all kinds of other problems. And then at the level of the elite, we clearly noticed that we also saw this tendency that more and more people believed that the democratic system should be replaced by a more technocratic system if we wanted to deal with the big challenges such as climate change, for instance. And then, so in 2017, I started to take notes, and then the Corona crisis started. And in a strange way, I had anticipated this crisis in 2019. In December 2019, I was talking with my friends on a holiday, and I told them, like, look, you will see, one of these days, we will wake up in a different world, in a different society, just because I noticed how all the negative parameters, stress, anxiety, burnout, all kinds of negative parameters were increasing exponentially. And I, in one way or another, had this intuition that this would lead to what is often called a catastrophe or a tipping point in complex dynamical systems, meaning that society would move to a new equilibrium, a new that it would reorganize itself. And then I decided at that moment to pay back my mortgage because I wanted to be as free as possible. And 2 months later,
it was prophetic, you know.
I don't know, maybe
it's something coming there.
Maybe it was an intuition, or maybe it was just
but it's funny,
something that happened accidentally.
In the book, you talk about going in to see your bank manager and explain to him why you're doing this. And, you know, you said even after a few hours of chatting to him, you felt as if, you know, he didn't take anything on board or understand anything that you said.
Yes, indeed. And well, then 2 months later, the Corona crisis started. And from the beginning, I had the impression that what we were dealing with was not a kind of a biological crisis, but rather a broad systemic crisis. Mm-hmm. And I started to study the statistics. I am a professor in clinical psychology, but I also got a master in statistics. And I was very familiar with problems in scientific research, and I knew that throughout the last 5 or 6 decades, most academic research was very flawed, like up to 85% of all the papers in, for instance, the medical sciences are completely wrong. John Ioannidis published this wonderful paper about this problem, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, is the title.
Well, I think that's a really, really important point. Yeah. And it was something I was reading when I was reading your book. It was like, wow, you called it the replication crisis of 2005, was it? Mm-hmm. In which it appeared that, you know, a very large percentage of scientific research could not be replicated, could not be repeated, and then led to further inquiry of maybe fraud and, you know, ideological bias, which is features quite significantly in your argument. And, you know, you lay the foundation that science, as we understand it, you know, is not to be trusted, or it's not to be relied upon to deliver objective data.
Indeed, that's a problem. Academic culture, in one way or another, does not succeed anymore in delivering high-quality research, or at least most research is not really trustable or valid. And I was studying this in 2005. I made my PhD about it. And when the Corona crisis started, I immediately had a feeling like, look, I've seen this all before. And I started to study the statistics a little bit. And I immediately got the impression that the statistics and the mathematical models involved dramatically overrated the dangerousness of the virus. And in my opinion, by the end of May 2020, this was actually proven beyond doubt, because then we could clearly see that the predictions made by the mathematical models of Imperial College, for instance,
Neil Ferguson,
Neil Ferguson, had been completely wrong. That even in the countries where no measures were taken, only maybe 5 or 10% of the predicted numbers of victims claimed by the virus were counted. So, in my opinion, this the fact that the mathematical models were wrong was proven at that moment. And it was strange to see that even at that moment, the narrative itself just continued as if the models were right. And so, but
so it's like trust the science until the science doesn't match the narrative, but trust the science anyway.
Yeah, yes.
You know, it's a major contradiction at the heart of the whole situation.
Yes, of course it was. And like in the first week of the crisis, I published an opinion paper already here in Belgium, And the title of this paper was the fear of the virus is more dangerous than the virus itself. And like throughout the first 2 or 3 months, from time to time, I tried to show people, like, look, the statistics are wrong. They just don't add up. It's clear. And I noticed something that I had noticed before in my academic career, that even if you confront people with the most clear-cut evidence that what they believe in is completely absurd, most people will continue to stick to what they believe in. And they will even get angry with you. And I had the same experience again in the crisis. And then
I faced that myself lots of times. Yeah, I've got direct experience of truth telling, isn't it? You know.
Yes, truth telling. Yes. So I decided at that moment, like, look, instead of continuing to try and to continue to try to show people that the statistics are wrong, I will focus on something else. I will focus on the psychological mechanisms that can explain why an entire population continues to believe in something that is, in many respects, utterly absurd. And that was where I started to think to use the theory on mass formation, because I was familiar with that theory.
Was that a eureka moment for you? Was that kind of like a breakthrough in trying to understand what was going on? Was that something that you were researching anyway?
Yes, I was lecturing on mass formation since 10 years at that moment. But the strange thing was that in the beginning of the crisis, it took me a few months to really fully realize that what was going on was a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation. And that shows that, I think, even the people that can remain a little bit critical in a phenomenon such as the corona crisis, even these people, to a certain extent, are under the spell of the phenomenon and have a hard time as well to really take a distance and see what was going on. So, but somewhere in August 2020, I really suddenly had the feeling like, look, yes, now I know what's going on. It's mass formation. It's a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation. And then it took me about 6 weeks, because I knew a lot of literature on mass formation, but it took me about 6 weeks to really be able to, and to put it in a narrative that was accessible enough for a large segment of the population.
Well, it was almost like the information that you presented to the world was almost as contagious as the mass formation that we were talking about, because it swept the world, didn't it?
Yes.
It really did. And it obviously struck a chord of truth with people, because all of a sudden, we had at least a competing theory, or at least an alternative idea to explain what was happening. So tell us about what that must have been like for you. All of a sudden, you're a lecturer or professor in Ghent University. The next thing you know, you're on podcasts and talks all around the world. How did you find that that wave of enthusiasm by people for wanting to hear what it is that you had to say?
Yes, it took me. I never really realized it. I think it was just like, okay, it's strange. Suddenly, everyone wants to hear about this mass formation, and definitely when people such as Eric Clapton started to talk about it, it was like a huge experience for me, because I've been playing this guy's song on my guitar when I was 16 years old. And then, yes, it was a remarkable experience. I think it's.
But he's quoted in the marketing for the book, isn't he, Eric Clapton? Which is
Yes. On the back cover, yes.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yes. So the strange thing was that two things were happening at the same time. On the one hand, at the academic level, at the university, people were not really glad with me speaking out in this way. So I had a feeling that my prestige that I had at university as a professor and as someone with quite a lot of academic papers. I have over 100 papers published on Web of Science. And it was as if all this prestige that I had been building up throughout the last 2 decades collapsed. And that suddenly... people.
Well, that's really interesting, because I did want to talk to you about that. But it's on the one hand, you have this global fame, if you like, amongst a group of people who are all pushing back. You give us some ideas to help that pushback, but at the same time, I was thinking, well, how will his university handle it, especially if they're caught up in the mass formation that you're speaking out over? I mean, it must have been something quite risky for you, or didn't you think in those terms? Did you just do it and find out what happens later?
I knew that it was risky to in a certain way, But I had the feeling immediately from the beginning of the crisis, like, look, if I don't speak up now, I will never have to speak out anymore. It's now that I have to do it. And I decided to do it, and I knew immediately that I would continue doing it. My university, on the one hand, well, they are not happy with it, but on the other hand, they still think I have the right to speak out.
Well, academic freedom, sure.
Academic freedom. So they stick to that principle. So that's a very good thing, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah.
But of course, you feel it. Like there is the group pressure around you.
Pariah status, you're excommunicated somewhere, aren't you, from the group?
Yes,
You know.
yes. I was sometimes officially. There were certain organizations at university who didn't want me to be a member anymore, so who excommunicated me. That's true.
Yeah.
But well,
But it's a really powerful. See, you know, that's why the church used that weapon for so long, because excommunication means expulsion from the group. You know, you no longer have access to social isolation, isn't it? You know, you become atomized, and you know, it's a very powerful tool. I've had it used against me too, and I know how profound it can be. Because when I was listening to your presentations on mass formation, I was involved in my own struggle in Liverpool, and we were resisting the government removing our fundamental rights and freedoms. You know, we were protesting. They took away our rights to protest, right to assembly, freedom of speech.
indeed.
You know, with no good cause. They don't have the authority or ability, I don't believe, to take them away in the first place. And we were arrested, locked up, you know, charged, all that kind of thing, which was a pretty traumatic experience, you know. But I remember listening to you, and it was, you said one thing which stuck with me. It was quite profound. It was, is that we have to speak out. It's our duty. It's not just an option, it's our duty. Because even though it comes at great personal risk to yourself, what awaits us on the other side of a truly totalitarian regime where all dissent has been removed from the public discourse, then that future is far worse than anything that we can risk right now.
Yeah.
Right? And that was a really profound statement with me, and that gave me the motivation to keep going. You know, and thank you for that. That was
I'm
a
happy.
great contribution. You know,
I'm happy to hear that. But indeed, I think the better you understand the mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms of what is going on, the better you know that it just makes no sense to stop speaking out. It's not because we stop speaking out that we will be safe. Not at all. Not at all. The contrary is true.
So let's talk about the psychological elements of mass formation, because you give a really good description. It's fourfold, isn't it? It's first of all, social isolation, which then leads to a lack of meaning, which then leads to free-floating anxiety, which then leads to free-floating aggression. Could you elaborate on that and tell us about those 4 stages that are essential for mass formation?
Oh, indeed, yes, I can. So, well, mass formation to begin with is it's a specific type of group formation, actually. But it's remarkable because it has such a specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. For instance, it makes people, and that's well known from the 19th century onwards, it tends to make people completely blind for everything that goes against what the group or the mass to which they belong believes in. That's one striking characteristic of the phenomenon of mass formation. And then second, also important at the phenomenological level, is that mass formation makes people radically willing to self-sacrifice. Once people are in the grip of a mass formation, it is as if they don't notice anymore that you're losing everything that was important to them before the mass formation. That's the second important characteristic. And then the third one is that once people are in the grip of mass formation, they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices, for everyone who doesn't go along with the masses, who doesn't buy into the narrative where they believe in. And this typically leads to the end stage of mass formation, where people start to commit cruelties towards the people who do not belong to the masses. And they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so. To do so. So that's typical for mass formations.
So it's not psychopaths doing it; it's empaths, if you like. They're committing the atrocities.
Yes. And that happens in every mass formation, whether you're talking about the Crusades or the witch hunts or the French Revolution or the emergence of communism or Nazism. We see it every time. The same tendency to start to commit cruelties towards the people who do not go along with the masses, and as if it is an ethical duty to do so. And this
It's like a dehumanization process, isn't it? So that committing those atrocities doesn't bring with it the conscience, the guilt, the empathic situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's dehumanization, indeed.
Yeah.
And well, this strange type of group formation emerges when very specific conditions are met in a society. There are different types of mass formation. I won't go into detail now, but this large-scale mass formation that in the end leads to totalitarian regimes emerges when very typical conditions are met in a society, and you mentioned them already. The first one is that many people have to feel socially isolated, and that, for instance, the number of people who felt socially disconnected or disconnected from both their natural environment and their social environment, the number of lonely people, disconnected people, increased time and time again throughout the last few hundred years. And that's the reason why the phenomenon of mass formation became stronger and stronger and stronger, and why in the end it led to this phenomenon of mass formation led to the emergence of a new kind of state, namely the totalitarian state. So before the 19th century, 20th century, there were classical dictatorships, for instance, but there were no totalitarian states. And this totalitarian state is different from a classical dictatorship because it is based on mass formation.
Right.
A classical dictatorship is based on a very primitive psychological mechanism. It's just the people that are scared of a small group, the dictatorial regime, and because they are so scared of it, they just allow that this small group imposes its social contract unilaterally to the society. But a totalitarian state is something completely different.
Do you think, the regimes in Russia and Germany in the 20th century were like transitional governments, where they were going from a classical dictatorship, which is what they visually look like, to this modern form of totalitarianism? Because you described the modern form of totalitarianism that doesn't have a bully boy or a strong man or an aggressor at the leadership. He has a faceless, soulless, bureaucratic, technocrat politician, which is quite a radical departure from what we witnessed in the early parts of the 20th century. So do you think that was a transition to bring us into this new technocratic age where, those type of leaders are non-existent anymore?
Yes, probably. It was probably somewhere something in between a classical dictatorship in this respect, as you describe it now, and the technocratic totalitarianism. But even the totalitarianism of the first half of the 20th century was radically different from a classical dictatorship. It was already, definitely, because like classical dictatorships are not based on mass formation, and these regimes were. That's Hannah Arendt characterized this in a very nice way. She said, totalitarianism is always a diabolic pact between the masses and their leaders. So what happens in a totalitarian state is that there first is a process of mass formation, which makes that people are fanatically in the grip of a certain narrative or a certain ideology. And then, once there is a mass, some leaders can use that mass to seize control over society. And in that way, a kind of state emerges which does not only control public space and political space, like a classical dictatorship do, but which also controls private space, just because the totalitarian state has a huge secret police, namely that segment, the mass, that 20 or 30% of the population, which is in the grip of mass formation and which is willing to report everyone, even their closest family members, to the state when they think these people are not loyal enough.
Well, that was one of the most disappointing things for me, was the way our own people, our neighbors, the people who live amongst us side by side, were so willing and so enthusiastic to snitch on their own brothers, their neighbors, their family, whoever. It got so bad in England that the police had to make a statement saying, can people stop ringing in because you're jamming up the lines? And it was like, okay, when we heard stories about how the Soviet Union, where children would snitch on their own parents and it was encouraged, and all of a sudden I could see how it was done, and there it was happening to us. That for me was like when it dawned upon me that this is a psychological flaw in the human species, or is it, is it a survival mechanism that's built into us that, when we're threatened, we form a group that works together in unison and is able to get rid of the threat, and maybe the elites have found how that works and they exploit it? I mean, what are your thoughts on mass formation as, part of evolutionary biology? How does it serve us? Is it a weakness, or what are your thoughts?
I think it's a weakness because mass formation in the end is always self-destructive, for instance. Yes. You could consider it an adaptive mechanism if it would really increase your chances of survival, but it doesn't, because in the end it becomes always self-destructive. And you know this strange phenomenon that people start to report each other to the state, or that people start to snitch. You can understand it perfectly once you understand the mechanism of mass formation. And what we've seen in the corona crisis was only the beginning, because after a while it becomes much worse. If mass formation continues, it might become much worse. For instance, I have been talking to this, 2 months ago, I had this conversation with a woman of Iran who lived in Iran during the revolution there in 1979, which was the beginning of a large-scale process of mass formation. And she said that she has seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the rope around his neck on the scaffold, and how, just before he was hung, she claimed to be a heroine for having reported him to the state. So that shows where the process of mass formation in the end leads to. It leads to this very strange characteristic that all the bonds between individuals, even those bonds that used to be extremely strong, such as the bond between a mother and her son,
it should be unbreakable, shouldn't it?
It should be unbreakable. They are not. Mass formation destroys all the bonds. But as I said, once you understand the mechanism, it becomes all very logical.
Yeah.
Because
I think that's why your ideas struck a chord so resonantly around the world, is because you gave that understanding to why our neighbors, our fellow man, was snitching on us to the state, and all of a sudden, now I understand.
Yes, indeed, it all starts with this most crucial condition, namely that many people should feel lonely in a society. And just before the corona crisis, over 30% of the people worldwide reported to have no meaningful relationship at all, and to only connect to other people through the internet. So before the corona crisis, the number of lonely people peaked in worldwide, and then once people feel lonely and disconnected, they will typically start to be confronted with experiences of lack of meaning making. That's just logical, because people are social beings, and their spontaneous experiencing of guilt and meaning and purpose in life emerges every time they have an effect on the other. And if the social bond with the other impoverishes and deteriorates, people after a while will be confronted, without usually them understanding it, with lack of meaning making in life. And once these two conditions are fulfilled, like once people feel disconnected, in a disconnected state, and once they are confronted with lack of meaning making, they will typically, something very important will happen at the affective level. They will typically be confronted with so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression that people cannot connect to a mental representation. And so a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression in which people don't know what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And if they are in this state,
they're ripe.
They're ripe, and it's a very aversive state. Just because if you feel anxious, you don't know what you feel anxious for, you have the feeling to be completely out of control. And in that case, if that happens, if people are in this state, something very specific might happen. It's just like if in this state a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, then all this free-floating anxiety might be connected to the object of anxiety, and people might be willing to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if the strategy is utterly absurd. That is what happens in the first stage of every large-scale process of mass formation. In the Crusades, the object of anxiety were the Muslims. In the witch hunts, the object of anxiety were the witches. And
but they were all short-lived mass formations, weren't they? They were like project-specific mass formations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whereas this is societal. This is seems to be the future that they want to establish as a ongoing constant.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's just because And the modern masses, when the modern masses formed, there were mass media. So the masses could be time and time again
Keep programming them,
reinfused with this narrative that leads to the mass formation through the mass media. And also a very important difference, that's something that is very often forgotten, usually forgotten, is that there is a crucial difference between the masses of modern times and the masses of ancient times. And it is that the masses of modern times are so-called lonely masses. Jacques Ellul described that. Lonely masses, that means that the masses of ancient times met physically.
Yeah.
They met physically.
Yeah.
There couldn't be a mass.
A virtual crowd, as it were.
Yes, but now we see something different. Now we see masses that are formed of individuals that are all living in an isolated state in their living room or in their house, but which can all be reached through the mass media, which can all share the same opinions, ideas, thoughts, the same myths, the same narratives, and which in this respect do really form a mass or a crowd, but a mass that is not physically gathered, that doesn't physically gather. And that
paradox, isn't it, to a large degree? Yeah.
It's a kind of a paradox, but at the same time, in this state, the lonely mass, so the state in which a large group of individuals is in the grip of the same mental forms and the same narratives, the same ideas, the same images, and so on, without being physically together, is the perfect state, is the most optimal state for propaganda to be efficacious. So it's that's why also, like, most totalitarian leaders, so mass formation emerges when many people feel lonely. And the first thing that totalitarian leaders usually do is to change loneliness into isolation. So that it means that they try to physically isolate the people.
Which is what we saw with the restrictions, wasn't it? All of the restrictions, in one way or another, were designed to atomize us as individuals rather than as a community of people. Social distancing, the masks, the lockdowns, everything increased our social isolation. Would you say that was a deliberate attempt by the totalitarian leaders in order to keep the mass formation going, because they wanted to keep everyone, you know, if that chain reaction, which is what you're saying, is 1 leads to 2, 2 leads to 3, 3 leads to 4, then the first stage, social isolation, is the most important because that leads to all the others. Would you then say that it's possible that this was a conscious plan by people who understand mass formation, they want a totalitarian regime, and this is how they're going to achieve it?
I think that many factors are at work together there. And then I'm now, at this moment, I'm writing this second book on propaganda and indoctrination. And I think at that moment it's very hard to say whether this was like a kind of an attempt to, an exaggerated attempt to control the spread of a virus. I think most experts really believed that they were trying to stop a virus. No matter how absurd their strategy was in many respects.
Well, they were caught up in the mass formation, so they believed it.
Of course, if you were talking with, I know some of the experts personally, and I've been talking with them, and it's clear from the first words you exchange with them that they really were in the grip of this narrative, and that it made them so blind and made them really incapable of seeing even the most elementary statistical mistakes they were making. But of course, or there are other people involved. It was for a long time. It was clear already that there were many people, both in the population and in the elite, that were convinced that we needed to move on to a technocratic state system. So, to what extent such conscious plans were involved to change,
because they really believe that, don't they? I don't think they're thinking, oh, let's just give them this bullshit right now. That they actually believe in this ideology. For instance, the World Economic Forum, they're going up there and speaking publicly about, they believe that this is the future for humanity, and if certain narratives help that future be realized, then maybe that's something that they're consciously trying to insert within the population.
Yes, I think it's good to distinguish between the level of ideology and the narratives that are used in the media, because I also think that most people who want to replace the democratic system by a technocratic system really believe in the ideology they represent.
Yeah.
That's what totalitarian leaders almost always do.
Yeah.
Almost everyone who has been writing about the topic of totalitarianism has stressed that you can never be a good totalitarian leader if you don't believe in the ideology they represent. Yes, they usually do believe the ideology they represent. But the narratives they use in the media are usually considered also by themselves as a kind of propaganda. That means as an instrument that is used to convince people to accept all the changes, that all the reshaping of the society that is necessary to organize society according to their ideology.
It's a means to an end, isn't it?
Yeah, so they believe so fanatically in their ideology. In this case, I think we are talking about transhumanist ideology, a kind of technocratic transhumanist ideology. The leaders of the masses usually believe so fanatically in their ideology. They really believe that they need to reshape society, to build a new society according to their own ideology, and that this new society will be like a kind of paradise after a while. They believe so fanatically in their own ideology that I think it is justified to lie, cheat, manipulate the population in order to convince them
Of the truth.
Yeah, yes, indeed. yes.
So I think, yeah, it's a really, profound idea of what's going on. I think, though, what's important, I think, is the first stage, which is social isolation, right? Because if we hope to have any way of freeing ourselves from mass formations and totalitarianism, we have to defeat this idea of social isolation and living as atomized individuals, interacting with digital devices rather than direct human interaction. And also we can see the path that's led us to this state of social isolation over the last 250 years, or especially since the Industrial Revolution, where we were on the land. All of a sudden, we were in boxes, pushing buttons, pulling levers, having no meaning to any of our existence. Like Nietzsche said, God is dead and we killed him. That whole dethroning of God and man replacing him, thinking that they had all the knowledge, has kind of come to its fruition here with what we're experiencing now. What are your thoughts on the historical nature of social isolation and what ideology has brought us to that alien existence in a sense compared to how we're designed, and what's the prognosis for the future?
Yes, if it's okay with you, I would want to add first some more thoughts about the social isolation itself and the process of mass formation, the role that mass formation plays in it. Indeed, so. Loneliness and disconnectedness is the core condition, the root cause, if you want, of the phenomenon of mass formation. But it is something typical about mass formation. Once mass formation starts, so I refer to the first step of mass formation, in which all the free-floating anxiety in a society is connected to this object of anxiety provided in a narrative, and then in which people all start to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. Well, that's the first step. The first step is a process in which the anxiety is connected to an object of anxiety, and then people start to participate in a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. And in this way, people can start to control their own anxiety.
So the mass formation begins at that point.
It begins at that point. That's the first step. But then, and that's important, a second step happens. And the second step is the following: because many people at the same time participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, a new kind of social bond emerges. So people feel connected again with each other. But, and that's important, you could say, okay, what's the problem? People felt lonely, they felt disconnected, and now they feel connected again. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's not a good thing, because this new social bond has very specific and destructive characteristics. The social bond in a mass is not a social bond between individuals. It's always a bond between the individual and the collective.
And
so the mass is a group that is formed not because individuals connect with each other, but because they all connect separately with the collective. Meaning that of the solidarity in a mass, which is very typical for a mass. When a mass emerges, there is always a kind of very enthusiastic solidarity, a very enthusiastic kind of citizenship. Well, this new solidarity is never a solidarity with other individuals. It's a solidarity with the collective.
It's an abstract idea, isn't it, more than anything? Yeah.
Yes, it's an identification with an abstract idea, a collective ideal. But then, as the longer the mass formation lasts, the more all the psychological energy, or the love, you could say, is sucked away from the bonds between individuals and invested in the bond between the individual and the collective. And it's that what explains that after a while, people show a maximal solidarity with the collective and a minimal solidarity with other people. And that makes that in the end, a mother is willing to report her son to the state, to the collective, if she thinks her son is not loyal enough to the state. And that shows us something very typical. Mass formation starts from loneliness. The cause of mass formation is loneliness, but the mass formation itself creates even more loneliness, even more isolation. And this can happen.
So it's like a vicious circle in a sense.
It's a vicious circle, of course, because after the mass formation, there's even more loneliness. And that's usually why immediately after the first mass formation, a second one starts. Like we saw with the war in Ukraine, we immediately saw after the corona narrative, when the corona narrative disappeared a little bit in the background, there immediately was the emergence.
It was seamless. It was,
seamless.
And lots of memes, isn't there? Where people, all of a sudden, they had their corona flag on Facebook, and now they'd switched it to the, Ukraine flag. It was just wow, okay. And especially if you were aware of mass formation and how it works, I could see it straight away. I thought, wow, look at that there, how that's happening. And people are just oblivious to it. They can't see it, or maybe don't want to see it,
They don't want to see it, of course not, because they know that the mass formation should not stop. They feel it intuitively, because if it stops, they will be thrown back in these four terrible conditions, this loneliness, this free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, and all this lack of connection.
So we never go back to the old normal. It's always the new normal.
Yes, indeed. Yes, and that's why they need new mass formations time and time again.
Yeah.
But now the strange thing is that this process of mass formation leads to isolation and loneliness, and this can happen in a spontaneous way, and it can be intentionally provoked. For instance, Stalin intentionally provoked the isolation of his population because he knew that when he could isolate the people, they would be even more sensitive for mass formation. And he would be able to continue his grip on them.
But he understood that social isolation allowed his totalitarian regime to maintain its power over a large mass number of people.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
But probably, and that's a strange thing, Hitler never tried to provoke that intentionally, never tried to intentionally isolate his population, but it happened nevertheless. And exactly because also spontaneously, a process of mass formation in which group identity is extremely strong leads to this impoverishment of the bonds between individuals, and in the end leads to isolation. So it can happen in two ways. It can be the isolation in mass formation can be intentionally provoked, or it can happen in a spontaneous way. And in both cases, the outcome is the same. In both cases, you have a population that is more isolated, more lonely after the mass formation. And we see this now clearly in the corona crisis. Like,
but you see people, don't you, campaigning and willing to bring the masks back or to bring the restrictions back because that's where they got the psychological, dopamine hit, if you like. And that's, they're like, a junkie craving their next hit. They want more restrictions. But there was another meme called "Govern Me Harder, Daddy," wasn't it? Did you see that one? It's like, it seems as if right now there is no new current thing. It seems as if Ukraine has faded. The mass formation in Ukraine was nowhere near as potent as the pandemic. It didn't last as long. It feels as if it's disappearing from view now. What do you think the new current thing is going to be to satisfy the need and yearning and desire of the population who have social isolation and a lack of meaning? What are they going to do next?
There will be a new narrative, and it might be initiated by the leaders, or the population might create such an.
Do you think narratives spontaneously?
Sometimes it does. Like it's clear that in Nazi Germany, for instance, there was first a mass formation in the population. The population became fanatically convinced of these race theories and stuff. And so the masses emerged first, and then from the masses, slowly, an elite developed, which took the lead over the masses, which were talented speakers usually, who could make the mass enthusiastic, and who then finally, together with the masses, could seize control of society. But then in the Soviet Union, it went the other way around. There was first the elite, who used first small scale, then larger scale propaganda and indoctrination, and who created the mass formation. So it can go in two ways.
Yeah.
It can go in two ways. And like now, people might suddenly become. I don't know if you're familiar with the phenomenon of needle spiking, for instance. Here in Belgium, there was just this like a mass hysteria about needle spiking, which was like a smaller scale phenomenon of mass formation, which suddenly erupted in society, suddenly emerged. So mass formation can emerge spontaneously. It can be artificially provoked, but one thing is almost sure. After a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation, a second and a third one will come, just because
that energy that is still there in society, isn't it? It hasn't been dissipated enough, you know?
Yes, that's one thing. That's one thing.
Yeah.
The population wants a new mass formation, but also the leaders know that the masses never should really wake up.
Yeah.
Because if they wake up, they will start to see the damage done
Yeah.
during the mass formation, and they will keep the leaders responsible. That's why Gustave Le Bon said, if you take the lead of the masses, you better prepare to die, he said, because as soon as they wake up, they will attack you. And
But it seems as if it's, they can be replaced easily. It's not leader specific.
No.
They don't need a charismatic strongman anymore. It's just the next bureaucrat in line will come in and continue, continue the narrative.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So the leaders can be replaced. But that's a characteristic of an important characteristic of totalitarianism and mass formation in general. If in a classical dictatorship, the point of gravity of the system is always situated in the elite, and consequently, if you eliminate a part of the elite, very often the classical dictatorship will collapse. But in a totalitarian system, the point of gravity is situated in the masses.
Yeah.
And that's why you can perfectly eliminate 50, 60, 70% of the totalitarian elite. The system will continue as if nothing happened. And that was what Stalin also realized very well. He started to eliminate the people in his Communist Party one by one, up to 60%, I believe. It was
Dictatorship of the proletariat. It sounds like a mass formation tactic,
Yes. And so the system continued. Nothing happened under Stalin. And the same holds, of course, for the dull bureaucrats who are leading the masses now. The same holds for them. They are very replaceable indeed.
What are your another part of your analysis, which I thought was really profound too, was that you were able to segment the population into who falls for mass formation and who doesn't. And you described it as 30% will be in the grip of the mass formation like a cult. And you have like 40% who just go along with it because they're probably more scared of the government than anything else, and they may have things to lose like jobs, careers, etc. And then there is this hardcore 30% which will always speak out against the mass formation, and the government, works night and day to make that 30% smaller into a 10%. Why do you think there is that kind of segmentation? Because it seems like a kind of a natural balance, isn't it? 30-30 with 40 in the middle, with the 30 at either end of the spectrum are fighting to get the 40 on their side. Why is it that you or I, for instance, weren't susceptible or vulnerable to the mass formation of
Nobody knows. Yeah. But the figures and the numbers are not always the same. It depends on the stage of mass formation.
Yeah.
Like the people who are really in the grip of mass formation, who are really hypnotized, because the phenomenon of mass formation is identical to hypnosis. So what happens in a mass formation is exactly the same as what happens in a hypnosis.
Do you think that's a better description, mass formation hypnosis, rather than mass formation psychosis?
I never used the term mass formation psychosis.
Okay,
no.
Right.
One time a podcast used the term, and then Robert Malone...
That was it, it was stuck. So that was it, the word was coined.
Yes, it was coined like that, the term, yes. And then Robert Malone used it on Joe Rogan's podcast, and then it spread around the world. But I never used it. Yeah. Because both from intellectual and ethical perspectives, I think it's better just to use the term mass formation. But it is identical to hypnosis. Yeah. In hypnosis, in a classical hypnosis, there is someone, a hypnotist, who withdraws all the attention of someone else from the environment and who then focuses all the attention on one small aspect of reality. And after that, it is as if the rest of reality doesn't exist anymore for the hypnotized person. And this mechanism is so strong that you can perfectly perform an open heart operation on someone who is hypnotized by a simple procedure. The person won't notice that you're cutting through his skin, his flesh, even through his breastbone to perform an open heart operation. That shows you how extremely strong this mechanism of the focusing of attention on one small aspect of reality is. And that is exactly what happens in a mass formation.
Well, I think
exactly.
That's really interesting. I've got quite a bit of experience with hypnosis myself over the years, and I went on a workshop when I was 19, long time ago. And at the end of the self-hypnosis workshop, the teacher, if you like, to seal the deal, right? He put a safety pin through our arm and take a photograph. Right? You do a hypnotic trance, if you like, before, which just says you're not going to feel any pain here. Didn't feel any pain, right? And then he says you're not going to have any blood come out either. Same thing. Removed the safety pin. There was no blood either. I was like, wow, what's just happened there? There's something a lot more profound than we're told in modern science is going on there. So I've always known the power of hypnosis. And like you describe, I'm a pretty good hypnotic subject. Yeah, I can go into trance quite easily, and if I want the hypnotic loop to work, I'll accept it. But mass formation won't, because I don't accept it, right? But what's interesting about the hypnotherapy scenario is that for it to work, the hypnotic subject needs a therapist. And that therapist isn't in the hypnotic loop. They are outside of it. Whereas in the totalitarian system, you talk about the leader and the masses create this self-fulfilling or biofeedback loop where one is hypnotizing the other. In that scenario, who is the hypnotherapist? Is that a third party inserting the hypnotic loop or narrative into that relationship?
Yes, it's always usually the hypnotist. In the case of mass formation, is someone of the elite or a set of group of people.
Because they must have a script in the same way the hypnotherapist has a script.
No, I think the script is very often, well, there are all kinds of, you always have to distinguish between, on the one hand, the masses and the societal elite, which is represented by a set of institutions who, of course, always have an idea in mind of how they want to see the future of society, and who usually indeed react to the masses by trying to impose or trying to convince them to go along with their ideological plans. So definitely, and we could also clearly see how parallel to each other throughout the last centuries, there was the development of the masses themselves. The masses became more powerful, lasted longer, got more and more power in society, and at the same time also the elite changed. The elite changed. Very interesting is that somewhere in the beginning of the 19th century, leaders in Western society were confronted with the fact that because of the democratic system, they were actually no true leaders anymore, because the leaders had to follow the masses if they wanted to be if they wanted to be elected. They had to anticipate about what the masses wanted, and they have to give them what they wanted. So
you have manufacturing consent, don't you? Which Chomsky.
Yes, Chomsky. Yes, exactly.
Brilliant analysis. Which you in a democratic society with mob rule, and if you want them to do something, then you have to manufacture their consent.
Of course.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I wanted to say. Yes, indeed. So from then on, that was the start of propaganda, or modern propaganda. And indeed, it was as if the people who tried to lead society realized that that is very well described by, for instance, Bernays in his book Propaganda. He said, look, we have only one chance. The masses are irrational, they are destructive, they are self-destructive, and there is only one way in which we can prevent them to destroy civilization, and it is by a very well-developed program of propaganda. But of course, what Bernays forgot was that what is so typical, for the leaders of the masses is that as soon as someone takes the lead of a mass, he becomes hypnotized himself.
So,
And the elite was perfectly hypnotized throughout the last few hundreds of years by their own ideology, by their own way of thinking. The ideology that is
self-fulfilling.
self-fulfilling and that also that typically dominates both the masses and the elite. And it's mechanistic, is this mechanistic view on man and the world, I think. And so what we see now is a strange, what Hannah Arendt called diabolic pact between the leaders of the masses, who are in the grip of their own ideology, their own mechanist, rationalist view on man and the world, and the masses themselves, who are also in the grip by their ideology, and who, if we don't watch out, will go hand in hand in the direction of the destruction of all humanity in our society.
It's like Marx says, doesn't he? Marx says democracy leads to socialism, which leads to communism. Was he maybe prophesizing, where we're at now? Are we in a transition period from democracy to this World Economic Forum, Great Reset, technotronic socialism? It's different, I think, than what the traditional idea of socialism is.
Yes.
I don't really think people see it in that.
No. Gustave Le Bon, who wrote this famous book on mass formation, the psychology of the crowd. That's the way in which is the title translated in English. He wrote the second book, a book of which almost nobody knows, the psychology of socialism.
Oh, wow.
Yes, the psychology of socialism.
Right, okay.
And he also describes that socialism is indeed one step in the direction of a state which has no social structure anymore, which is led by the masses, and which is radically destructive.
So that's seems like the perfect breeding ground for multiple mass formations to keep,
of course,
like Animal Farm and Orwell.
And still I believe that, in my opinion, the most important thing, the ultimate cause of the problem of totalitarianism and mass formation has to be situated at the level of the underlying ideology. I believe that it is our mechanist, rationalist ideology that is the ultimate cause of the problem of totalitarianism, and in particular the rationalist aspect of this ideology. That's what I try to describe in my book in the first 5 chapters.
I thought that was an excellent analysis, and really, I thought, for me, helped me to understand, why we're in the situation we're in now. And I think it's a good time for us to maybe segue into that and talk about the whole mechanistic ideology, what that means and why it's dominant, and why science is a slave to mechanistic ideology and produces such inaccurate results.
Yes. Well, in the beginning, let's say in the beginning of the 16th century, or when modern science emerged in our society, science was a discourse of a minority, through which a minority went against a dominant discourse, a dogmatic, institutionalized, religious discourse. And at that moment, it was very fruitful, I think. But when science started to become the dominant ideology itself,
scientism,
scientism, then the problem started, of course. And then then in one way or another, the scientific view on the man and the world became equal to the mechanist view on man and the world. The mechanist view on man and the world, which believes that the universe is a kind of a material machine, a set of elementary particles that all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics, and it can be perfectly described in a rational way, in a logical way. And in a strange way, it is this view on man and the world that ultimately leads to, in the first step, to disconnection between the human being and its natural and social environment. And this first step is a very important step, I think. It has long been neglected, I think. This strange side effect of mechanistic thinking, and is this connection between, or this association between mechanistic thinking, rationalistic thinking, and this disconnection from the human being with its environment. is on the one hand, well, you can understand it in several ways. On the one hand, when you believe, as mechanistic thinkers do, that that your rational understanding is really capable to grasp the essence of the world around you, that in itself leads already to a certain mental disconnection. And I experienced that very much in my own life. There was this time when somewhere in between my 16 and my 35 years old, I also really believed, that the essence of life around us could be rationally understood and could be grasped in the categories of my own rational, logical thinking. And I think that when you really believe that you can reduce everything to the categories of your own logical thinking, it is literally as if you build a wall around you that disconnects you from your environment. When you think strictly logical, when you're convinced that everything can be understood in a logical way, you actually connect the one logical idea to the other, and you build like a closed wall which disconnects you from your environment, because you are so sure that everything around you can be reduced to the categories of your own thinking. You are not capable anymore of opening up and connecting to the mystery of life around you. And I very much experienced this difference when I suddenly, when I was around 35 years old, I started to become familiar with the mathematical basis of complex dynamical systems theory, which shows in a wonderful way, paradoxically, systems theory shows in a strictly rational way that the essence of every complex dynamical system in nature, which is most systems in nature, is strictly irrational. Literally, complex dynamical phenomena in nature behave as an irrational number behaves in mathematics. And it was at that moment that I really started to understand that what we call the facts around us, what we call reality around us, that it's unknowable. It's unknowable. It's irrational.
Yeah.
And that was the moment for me when I started to become aware that I would never be able to grasp the essence of life and nature around me in a rational way, in a logical way. And it's also at that moment that I think that almost literally the logical building blocks of your mental system start to slide away a little bit from each other. And it is literally as if there are openings or holes in the wall through which the eternal music, the vibration of life, can go through the wall and touch the strings of your own body and your own soul. And I think that metaphor can be understood almost in a literal way. It is first at that moment, it's at the moment that you become aware of the limitations of your own logical understanding, that you really start to develop the capacity to resonate with the things around you, to know the things around you in a different way. Like René Thom said, a famous mathematician, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, who said this part of reality that can be understood in a rational way is very limited. And the rest of reality you have to understand in a resonating way, he said. Maybe also what Niels Bohr meant when he said, the famous physicist who won the Nobel Prize for his investigation in elementary particles, he said, I think that it was when they awarded him the Nobel Prize, he said, when it comes to atoms, language can only be used as poetry. So that fact, it's this rational understanding. As soon as we imprison ourselves in logical thinking, rational understanding, we start to disconnect from our natural and social environment. And
it's kind of liberating, isn't it? It's liberating to know that you can't know everything.
It's liberating.
It's liberating because it's, with this rationalistic thinking that man is the controller of all knowledge or the revealer of all knowledge, then your quest is to find all knowledge, isn't it? But once, the scientists that you mentioned, almost mystics, they moved from being rational science because the deeper they looked, the more they realized that we can't know this. We don't have the measuring tools. We don't have the perception. And it takes you back to the place where they started, which was at the beginning of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, which we're meant to be moving away from poetry, metaphor, narrative, and we're moving to hard empirical data. But mathematics gives us the answer, the truth all the time. But the reality is the further they've gone along that route and that journey, is now they're starting to realize, though, there was something to be listened to from that point of departure, which the Enlightenment began. And in a sense, the Enlightenment has led us to this mechanistic ideology, which creates the fertile ground for the mass formation and totalitarian regime that we're, currently standing in front of.
Of course, yes. And on the one hand, mechanistic thinking in itself creates this disconnection, but also the ensuing industrialization, mechanization of the world, and the excessive use of technology, which is associated to this mechanistic thinking, also leads to a disconnection from the environment. I give many examples in my book how the industrialization of the world, the use of technology, at first sight seem to make our lives easier, and they actually do in certain respects. But then there's something we don't notice, or we are not aware of, that they also isolate us from our environment. I give many examples in my book of how the subtle psychological isolating effects of the use of technology and the mechanization of the world, or at least the excessive use of technology and the excessive industrialization of the world, disconnects us from our environment. And then in a second step, we have this disconnection that leads to this lack of meaning making, that to this free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, that to mass formation, and mass formation to totalitarianism. So if we want to find a real solution for the problem of totalitarianism, we will have to move beyond that mechanist thinking.
Which is quite revolutionary. I mean, how are your ideas about transcending mechanistic ideology entertained in your university, which I guess is a hub of mechanistic thinking? Is there other professors and scientists who think like you? Is this something you regard as a growing movement? This search for a new ideology to replace the mechanistic worldview that seems to be the biggest problem we've got right now?
Almost all academics, I think, are in the grip of this mechanistic thinking. And I can understand...
Is that a mass formation in itself, the mechanistic thinking?
I don't know, but it's at least the root cause or the ultimate cause of mass formation, or of the modern masses.
And like mechanistic thinking removed God from the equation, pretty much, isn't it?
Yes, that's one thing. It just,
and that lack of meaning as a result of not having any higher power or any ideas of an afterlife or anything other than this existence. Atheism became the dominant ideology or the belief system that this existence is all there is. What's the point of having ethics? What's the point of having principles? You're here for 75 years, make the most of it, and then you're gone. Right?
Indeed. Yes.
So it kind of, the behavior patterns we see is a logical, result of that way of thinking. But it seems to me that there's an emergence amongst academics, intellectual scientists and stuff of now trying to find, well, can we move back to not religion as such, but some idea of the other realms, the other levels of consciousness,
Yes. Well, I think that all seminal and groundbreaking scientists left this mechanist thinking behind. They almost all did, but most academics didn't. Most academics are still firmly in the grip of this mechanistic thinking. I think, on the one hand, just because it feels so comfortable if you can believe that everything can be understood in a logical way around you.
Yeah.
Everything in the world can be explained rationally. And the strange thing is that people stick to this kind of rationalist thinking, even when science itself actually clearly showed that rational understanding is very limited in
grasping. Like a microcosm of the pandemic, is that the same patterns are at play.
Yeah. And what's so strange is that if people are not willing to accept the limits of rationality, they eventually end up in radical irrationality. That's a strange thing, in the most absurd irrationality. So I think in many respects it's just quintessential and of crucial importance that we become aware that rational understanding can never be the true basis, can never be the cornerstone of human living together, and it can never be the cornerstone of understanding or of knowing reality. We need to move on to a different kind of knowledge, which is much more resonating knowledge, and which will be, I think that's once as a culture and as a society, we can become aware of that. We are ready to move on to a new kind of society, which will really free us from the problem of totalitarianism.
As a psychologist, do you ever look at parapsychology, the other realms of consciousness? Because I know what I found interesting was some of the scientists that you quoted in the book regarded that the more you look at matter becomes a thought form of consciousness. Does matter exist? What is matter? What is a woman? It's kind of like, why can't we describe the most fundamental building block of the universe? And when they do try to describe it, they describe it as, in a creative language. And that Plato could have been right with his original ideas. And wouldn't some of those questions be answered by parapsychology, the investigation into other realms of consciousness, which kind of was pushed out of the way during the Enlightenment by Descartes and Kant? Have you got any thoughts on that, or are we going too far?
No. You can perfectly ask me.
Yeah.
I've never invested a lot of energy in parapsychology or something. I believe that we first have to follow rationality as far as possible to be able to arrive really at the limit of rationality.
Does faith follow that limit of rationality?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's what science showed us in such a brilliant way, that if you follow rationality as far as possible, then you arrive at a point where, at the limit of rationality. And it's there, I think, that we can feel something of that what transcends rationality, and that was articulated or described in a very eloquent way by Max Planck, for instance, a Nobel Prize winner, the physicist Max Planck, who said, like, I have been investigating, I have been doing scientific research for my entire life, and I can tell you, he said, that in my opinion, science ultimately arrives where religion once started, in a personal contact with something that transcends rationality. And I prefer to follow. I think that we should realize that the tradition of enlightenment gave us something wonderful. It gave us something wonderful. We should first follow rationality as far as possible, and then at the end point, I think, try to feel something of what transcends rationality, which will offer us the most.
Is it like a synthesis of rationality and religion, if you like?
Maybe.
Is that the next possible route we could go? Because the rational revolution was the antithesis to the religious thesis, wasn't it? So what's going to come out the other end? What's being threatened to be spat out the other end is this transhumanist future, which seems to me the extreme end of the mechanistic ideology.
Of course, yes.
That doesn't seem to be something that is particularly revolutionary in a sense. It feels as if it's more of the same and more about imprisoning man to his slavish vices rather than any kind of spiritual transcendence.
Yes.
We have the potential for, but it seems we're getting blocked at every stage.
Transhumanist ideologists also say this in a very explicit way. The human being should become God. It will possess a perfect rational knowledge. It will be capable of eliminating death and dying. So man should become God. That's exactly the opposite of what the truly religious stance implies, in which you always situate the true knowledge and the true power outside of you, in which you're always aware that you are mortal, or that your life here on this earth will not last forever.
Well, they believe that they are the generation of the immortals, don't they? I think even
Yes.
David Rockefeller once said that in a speech. We are the immortals, because they think that they have developed, they've beaten the code of life, or they've going to cheat death. But somehow I don't think it's going to be as easy as that.
If I would choose between dying and living in a transhumanist way, I would prefer dying. Yes.
But maybe dying is the escape. Maybe dying isn't such a bad thing after all.
No.
But in a mechanistic ideology, then yes, dying is probably the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to you, because you face oblivion. No,
Yes.
There's nothing else beyond that.
Of course.
But so yet in that ideology, no wonder everyone was terrified of the flu during the pandemic, because in that mechanistic ideology, you catch the flu, it's over, and people cling on to life to the very last breath for that reason. And maybe there is something else that we should consider rather than this obliteration.
Yes, I also think that one of the most fundamental diseases of our culture now is that people are not capable of tolerating our mortality.
Yeah.
And I noticed in my own life that as soon as you start to become aware of the limits of your own understanding, as soon as you can accept them, and as soon as you can move on from focusing on rational understanding to a more resonating knowledge, that at that moment you also start to become capable of tolerating the idea that once your life here on earth will end. I think that's only logical. When I look back, I think that it's just because as soon as you can start to resonate with something eternal, as I said, the eternal music of life around you, at that moment, you feel that you participate in something that will not end at the moment your physical existence ends. And so there is a strict connection, I think, between our fanatic, obsessional belief in the capacities of our own logical understanding, and the fact that we cannot tolerate our mortality anymore. I think that that's maybe the most important challenge we are facing now. It's developing a new view on man and the world, which can give death its appropriate place again in life. And even if people in our if contemporary if people now would be capable of tolerating, of accepting their mortality, I think there would have been no chance that something like the Corona crisis would have ever existed.
Yeah. That's where there's interesting anecdotes of people who have near-death experiences. To them it's very, very real. There's quite a body of evidence, and they say it completely and utterly transforms their life on Earth when they return from their out-of-body experience, because that fear of death is gone. So they can enjoy the time that we have here in the moment and every single day, and which is in contrast of someone who is in fear of death every single minute of every single day, and how that affects our behavior as a species.
Yeah.
So moving on to the last section, I want us to talk a little bit about continuing to talk about the future and how we can help communicate better ideas. Now, it seems to me that the human being is far more in tune to stories and narratives and archetypes and metaphors, that it sings to the soul on a much more resonant level than mathematics and numbers and statistics, which seem to be manipulating man in a way that's proven to be detrimental. I mean, for instance, Bill Gates recommended one of his favorite books, which is on his blog, and it's called How to Lie with Statistics. And he doesn't make no bones about it. He says everyone should read it. So what are your thoughts about narrative and how we can use that as part of our experience moving forward and as part of our development? Because you talk about Levi Strauss, who is very interested in the idea of archetypal narratives. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, well, indeed, like mechanist ideology believed that metric information, measurements, figures, numbers, are like the ultimate information, and that through metric information we can accurately describe reality around us. And I think that's just not true. That's the first thing that's clear. That is clear is that only a very limited number of objects or characteristics can be adequately described in numbers. Chapter 4 of my book is about that, of the limit. Like even something like the coast of Great Britain can never be adequately measured. It's impossible, and that's something that was shown by Mandelbrot, one of the also a famous mathematician of the 20th century. And a human being, the reality,
because that was the main thrust of the pandemic propaganda, was the constant use of statistics and graphs.
No.
You know, sold to us as fact, as 2 + 2 = 4, and if you think otherwise, then you're crazy.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. While it is clear that something like the number of victims claimed by the virus can never be adequately expressed in numbers. It's always a consensus. Like people die of many things at the same time. So dying of something, dying is not a unidimensional phenomenon. You die of numerous times, maybe because of a virus, but also at the same time because of your immune system that is weakened, or because of several conditions you were suffering from. So like it was clear in the crisis, like 95% of the people who were registered as victims of the virus actually had 2 or more other medical conditions, I think. So
it was control of the statistics which gave the state control of the narrative.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And statistics, numbers have this strange psychological effect that when people see numbers, they are convinced that they see facts.
Do you think that's because language is so uncertain? There's so many different variations on what language means and so many definitions, whereas we believe that numbers are absolute.
Yes, we do believe that numbers are absolute, which they are not.
Yeah.
Which they are not. And indeed, we want, as a human being, we constantly want to escape the uncertainty. Because uncertainty is something very typical for a human being. Animals usually don't doubt very much. And that's simply because they are using sign systems to communicate. And the sign always refers to one object, to one aspect of reality. When an animal receives a sign from another animal, there will never be a phase in which it really starts to doubt what the other animal wants to say. It will be immediately clear for an animal, like that sign usually refers to this. And in a human being, it's different. Human beings communicate with words.
Well, this conversation we're having now is on so many other levels other than just the words, isn't it? You know?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
Words mean something different dependent on the context they appear in. So a human being can never be certain, just because when it hears a word, it needs another word to interpret that first word. And then it needs still another word to interpret
the next word. So does the totalitarian state offer humanity certainty?
Yes,
but
that's what it tries to
deliver.
Yes. Human beings are constantly confronted with uncertainty. And on the one hand, they can react to that with anxiety, because it makes them uncertain about their life, their what they mean to other people, what they can expect of the future, and so on. Or on the other hand, this fundamental uncertainty can make someone realize that he can and should always interpret life in his own way, and that he has the right to make his own choices. That's the positive way in which we can deal with uncertainty. And totalitarian states always experience uncertainty as in a negative way. And that's why they try to eliminate all uncertainty in life by massively imposing one discourse and only one discourse to society. That's what Stalin said. In the optimal case, he said, the population would respond to me just like the dog of Pavlov responded to Pavlov. I would say something and they would immediately react with the one desired reflex. That's what Stalin had in mind.
I think there's a lot of Pavlovian behavioral science that goes on in our science. So leading up to my last question, or my last topic, which is, in light of what we've just discussed, is there any such thing as objective truth, or is all truth subjective?
That's a very good question. I think that
For instance,
Then truth is something that has to be reinvented time and time again.
Yeah.
That's something I think, because Max Jacob said this and articulated this in a wonderful way. He said, the truth is always new. So it means that I think the truth is out there, but we can never articulate them in a definitive way.
if reality is ultimately unknowable, then objective truth is unknowable at that level too.
Yes,
isn't it?
indeed. That's the point, I think. Objective truth exists, but outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's only from time to time, in privileged moments, that we can catch a glimpse of the truth,
Yeah.
and that we can put it in words, which will represent the truth for a certain amount of time. But after a while, we will have to reinvent the truth and re-articulate it.
Is that why those great scientists say that in order to articulate those brilliant moments of insight where they are flashed with universal absolute truth, that the only way to describe them is through poetry and through metaphor?
Yes, I
Because
think so.
mathematics certainly won't give you the beauty and aesthetic glory we need to understand those insights.
Yeah.
If absolute truth and objective truth is beyond us on a general level, other than maybe those great men who have those insights, how do we manage a world in which subjective truth is more dominant? Because your truth might be different than my truth, mightn't it? And, you know, how does that affect us in terms of moving forward, facing this totalitarian regime in which the totalitarian leader's subjective truth is all that matters, isn't it? Because that's what he's imposing upon society. Is there a way to square this circle?
Probably. I do believe so. I believe that we have to reappreciate the value of truth speech to begin with, because we forgot that. We are all talking about correct information now, but nobody is talking about the truth anymore. And truth is something different than correct information. The ancient Greeks distinguished between 4 different types of truth speech. A prophecy, wisdom, something they called techne, and something they called paresia, which were 4 different ways to speak the truth. And none of these ways to speak the truth is easy to define. Just because to speak the truth, you have to be in touch with something outside of you, something that you can never grasp into words, in a definitive way. You always have to reinvent the truth at every moment. And it's that, at this moment now, society follows people who pretend that they possess about the most correct information. And we should make the switch to a society which attributes authority again to people who master the art of truth speech, such as the ancient Greeks meant with that word. So I think we have to make, definitely, like, you know, this 4th type of truth speech, paresia, which I referred to, is actually exists of a kind of speech which someone manifests when he defies the groups around him. So when a dominant narrative starts to emerge in a society, the dominant narrative almost always gets perverted, and in one way or another, if there are no people who go against it, society dies because of that narrative. And the people who take the responsibility and speak out at that moment put themselves at risk.
Isn't that what Socrates did, wasn't he?
Yes,
Put to death for speaking the truth, corrupting the youth, was it?
Yes, indeed, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was something Socrates did.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of truth speech we should reappreciate them. We should start to understand that without truth speech, there can be no fruitful society, and there can be no human living together. That will be the challenge we are facing now. We'll have to switch from a society that believes in that correct information and rational understanding should be the cornerstone of human living together, to a society which reappreciates the value of truth speech again.
Okay, well, Mattias, it's been a fantastic conversation. We've covered quite a few subjects there, and I feel as if we could keep talking throughout the night, but you know, we're gonna cut it there. I just want to say that your book is fantastic. Really, really enjoyed reading that. Very insightful, and anyone out there, go and get a copy. So, have you got any last things that you might want to say? You know,
Yes, maybe one thing that we didn't really cover during our conversation, but I think if you, the better you understand the mechanism of mass formation and of totalitarianism, the more you realize how important it is that we continue to speak out. Just because, like, mass formation is a psychological process. It's similar or identical to hypnosis, meaning that it is a phenomenon that is provoked by the voice of someone, and that's exactly a mass formation emerges when a population is in the grip of the voice of a few leaders, and that's exactly why totalitarian leaders, whom system is always based on mass formation, use so much propaganda and indoctrination. They realize that their grip on the population is based on their voice. And so they constantly distribute their voice through the mass media in the population. And as soon as you understand that, you also understand that what disturbs the process of mass formation is exactly the dissonant voice. The voices who go against the mainstream narrative, or who speak out in a different way. And history has shown us that it is exactly at the moment that there is no dissonant voice anymore, that the masses start to move on, to the last stage of mass formation, in which they start to commit cruelties to the people who do not go along with them. That was already described in the 19th century by Gustave Le Bon. He said like that if people who do not go along with the masses speak out, they usually won't succeed in waking up the masses, but they will prevent, he said, that the mass hypnosis becomes so deep that the masses start to commit atrocities. So that's just crucial. When you speak out, you might feel disappointed, and just because you do not succeed in convincing the people who are in the grip of mass formation, but you have to realize at that moment that it's not because you cannot convince the masses that you do not have an effect. You have an extremely important effect at that moment. You have the effect that you disturb the mass formation and that you prevent the people, the masses and their leaders, to become so fanatically convinced of their own ideology that they think it is justified to eliminate everyone who doesn't go along with them.
We saw that in the pandemic, is that it was leading towards quarantine camps.
Yes.
Forced vaccination. Yeah, that was the discourse. That's where there was being threatened, and ID passes and the restrictions. Violence basically at some level of the state was going to use its monopoly on violence, egged on by the population who was telling the states to do it. For some reason, right? That ended, and it ended really quickly, didn't it? When the pandemic ended, it wasn't like a slow tail off. It was it was gone.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think that was because of the dissent, the dissonant voices of people who were really pushing back?
Of course.
Do you think that was it?
Yes.
What you're talking about, inaction happened during the pandemic?
Yes, definitely. History has shown us what happens if the dissonant voices stop to speak out. For instance, that happened in 1930. And in the Soviet Union, in 1935, in Nazi Germany, at that moment the resistance went underground. They had the feeling that it became too dangerous to speak out in public space. They decided to stop speaking out, and within a period of 6 months, about 6 months, in both countries, the destruction campaign started. So the dissonant voice has to continue to speak out, and history has also shown us the opposite, that even a very small minority of people that continue to speak out are able to defy the masses and to keep open a certain path on which people who do not go along with the masses can survive. So that happened, for instance, in France at the end of the 19th century with the Dreyfus affair. There is a minority of French people, about a few 100,000 of people, continued to speak out, and they prevented that the masses won in that case. And so that's, once you realize that, you see that there is no other option than to continue to speak out. You have to do it for yourself, because otherwise the totalitarian system will become extremely aggressive. You also have to do it for the people in the masses themselves, because what the masses don't know is that in the end they will destroy themselves. That's what Hannah Arendt described in a beautiful way. She said, the masses always become a monster that devours its own children. And you also had to do it just because if you continue to speak out, you will go to a very fast process of psychological and mental evolution. And that's also something that typically happens when a mass forms. There's this small group who doesn't go along with it. And if this group continues to speak out in a quiet way, not in the first place because it tries to convince the other people, but just because it wants to live up to the ethical duty every human being has, namely to just articulate the words that seem sincere and honest words to them. If you continue to do so, you will feel that it leads you through a process of fast evolution as a human being. And that in itself is already something that makes that this entire crisis and everything that happens now will not be experienced as something absurd, but will be experienced as something meaningful, a process in which a large organism, this mass or this dominant society, exerts a lot of pressure on a small organism and pushes it on a path where it would not go without the large group putting pressure on it. So in this way, what we are going through now is perfectly a process in which a large organism gives birth to something new. And that in itself offers us a nice perspective, I think, on what happens now.
Well, what a fantastic way to end the podcast by encouraging people to speak the truth and to speak out, because you're right, it's the most important thing we can do, and it's non-violent, it's peaceful, it's just speaking, isn't it? You know, and our words have an incredible, profound effect, you know, which is why they try to shut us up. You know, if our words didn't mean so much, they would shut us up. But okay, so Mattias, it's been great chatting to you. Thank you for inviting me to Ghent in Belgium. I've never been to Belgium before. Unfortunately, I haven't seen much of it yet because we've been traveling on Ryanair's disastrous airline. And hopefully after this, we're going to go and grab a beer and have a little look around Ghent. But
enjoy the city, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Great to meet you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.